April 28th began as a typical day in the life. We were doing typical things. My wife and I had gone into Lethbridge, Alberta, which is a half-hour drive from where we live in Taber, to do some shopping. We got in the door and the phone was ringing. The voice on the other end of the line said, "This is the hospital calling. Your son Jason is in the emergency ward, and it's very serious. You need to come to the hospital right now." We got to the hospital and got into the emergency, full of anxiety and fear, of course. A person greeted us and said, "Your son Jason's been shot." Can't tell you how shocking, how unbelievable to hear those words. I can't tell you how much we all live in that place where it always happens somewhere else to somebody else.
None of it makes sense. Why would anyone take a 13-year-old girl to a shack, on her way home, obviously on her way home from school, and tie her and leave her there to die? None of it makes sense. And to this day, we don't know who did it.
In March of 1980, I received a phone call early one morning from an RCMP officer from Montreal telling me that my brother had been found murdered and left dead in a field outside of Montreal. So then you become the victim. And then I needed then a frame of reference for me to be able to keep functioning in the ministry. And then I started looking more closely at the Bible, at the history, at the theology. And I started discovering that in the best of tradition, there's a lot of violence, but there's always also a trend that starts speaking that in any conflict that arises, we must hear the voice of the victim. But we must also listen to the story of the offender. And so I started doing more research, and I discovered that what I call an incredible treasure, which is restorative justice.
Restorative justice is both a philosophical and a spiritual movement, reflecting on criminal justice reform. Whatever else crime might mean in the conventional criminal justice system, it means something very, very specific in restorative justice. It says that crime breaks human relationships, that what it does is destroy the peace and security felt in community, that it makes it impossible for victims and offenders alike to continue living in peace and security unless those harms have been healed. In short, what restorative justice says is that the harms caused by crime have to be healed through peace.
Restorative justice builds on an understanding of crime that is more than just law-breaking, but that also involves injury to victims, to communities, to even the offenders and their families.
Restorative justice is about rehabilitation at a certain level. It's about deterrence and about protecting the community from offenders. It's very much about that. And it's also very much about doing justice. It's about getting offenders to take accountability for their actions. It's about getting justice done for victims by dealing with the harm and the injury that happens to victims. It's about healing the relationship between the offender and the victim, between the offender and the community, between the victim and the community, all of those things that are broken down in a criminal offense.
And I want to quote in that context Berman, that's on page 6 of his introduction. It's a short quotation. It says, "In the 20th century, however, for the first time, religion has become largely a private affair, while law has become largely a matter of practical expediency. The connection between the religious metaphor and the legal metaphor has been broken."
In our discussions and debates during this week, we were really fascinated with a number of issues arising from the discussions that has enriched my own knowledge about my own tradition. And I have learned a great deal from other perspectives and other religious traditions.
And I think it's the case within all our traditions.
Theoretically, at its best, Islam has many elements of restorative justice because Islam is very much of has a legalistic component when it comes to crime and punishment, and that legalistic component is mostly compatible with restorative justice ideas and programs.
Your body never took that kind of thing, your inner cleanliness and everything.
In the case of Buddhism, there hasn't been historically enough sensitivity to the problem of the victim and the problem of, again, restoring the whole social fabric. And this is where I think the restorative justice movement has something extremely important to offer to Buddhism and to the Buddhist understanding of the situation.
I've heard over and over again how the lawyers try to silence the victims. They don't want the emotion in the courtroom. They don't want any outbursts. They want nothing of the reality and the trauma and the truth-seeking that a victim needs. We also want some kind of prevention, some kind of assurance that this isn't going to happen again, and that isn't being given to us either in the courtrooms, because the courtroom doesn't solicit any kind of remorse response, at least not usually, from the offender, and that's what we want. Why do we want remorse? Why do we want repentance? It's not just so that we'll feel good. It's so that we know that that person won't ever do this again and that we can feel safe.
Through the process of listening and talking and feeling, there's a space opened where people can be healed. The circle process is a unique combination of an Aboriginal concept of healing circles and a Western concept of sentencing. Now that might sound like a strange combination, but somehow it has been able to integrate and as a result honor the Aboriginal traditions at the same time as honoring the Western tradition of rights and procedure, which for many liberal scholars is critical for the Western culture.
Now, I was very afraid, using his vehicle as a weapon. That's what I felt he was doing.
A sentence of jail would probably ensure that you were in jail again. It would not solve the problem and the public would not be protected. And I am prepared to take the calculated risk and follow the recommendation of the family and circle with respect to sentencing. The difference with this process is it's a very emotional encounter. The process could last from 3 hours to 7 hours. It's very demanding on the participants. They have to be prepared to listen to what people have to say, and not only listen but hear what they have to say and respect the difference between individuals. And through the process, empathy develops, an understanding of each other, not only the offender and the victim, but everyone in the process. They have to be open to emotion and feeling. And in that process, there comes a stage where something happens. And it's been described by people who participate as magic, gestalt shift, depending on which perspective you come from, a spiritual experience. But it's that point of connectiveness between the participants that's critical in the process. Now you can appreciate that's not what normally happens in a traditional courtroom.
I knew I was guilty of the crime that I committed, and I actually pled guilty, and that was the only time that I actually got to say anything. I was asked if I understood the severity of my offense, and I said yes. And that was one word I spoke in 5 or 6 court appearances. All the rest, your lawyer does the talking for you. You're not allowed to say anything. You're not allowed to appear any way at all. I wasn't even allowed to look at my wife sitting in the courtroom. He said, better if you don't look there, because I told him, I said, if I look there, I might break down. He says, well, don't do that. If you're going to break down, don't look that way. So you don't even look at them.
I think that with the retributive justice system, victims are often, and most of the time, left out of the equation. And so are the offender in a way, because his needs are not met as well. And so the concept of restorative justice appeals to me in that it requires one to take responsibility and accountability.
I've dealt with a lot of that shame and embarrassment. I mean, feelings that will only keep putting you back, right? I mean, you can't move forward until you heal yourself. But once I reached that point, the first thing I wanted to do was reconciliate or mediate with my victim. I mean, that to me, and that's an ongoing process for me now. I am presently involved in the victim reconciliation or mediation process with my victim. To this point, I haven't had a face-to-face with my victim, but I'm hopeful that will soon come about.
How are you going to heal? And then when you get out on the street, where do you go? You get back into alcohol, you get back into drugs, and then you get back into a correctional.
Our prisons are full with a disproportionate number of our people, and we need to change that. And I despaired of ever seeing that change, but I see it's going to become a reality, because I can see it reflected in your faces and your expressions and the work you've done here today, and it's happening all over the country.
As far as I know, for the first time in the history of Victoria, B.C. or Canada, has there been a totem raised in front of a police station. When the pole was unveiled, it marked the beginning, hopefully, of a new relationship between law enforcement and the native peoples and Aboriginal peoples of all areas, not just this area.
The totem will stand at the center front of the police building and will remind all of us of the Unity Pledge in the years ahead. The Unity Feast marks the third phase of a number of initiatives designed to increase understanding between cultures. This is the beginning of a renewed commitment to build a community respectful of all persons, a community which views itself as enriched by diversity.
My name is Doug McCaskill, and I'm an inmate here at William Head. And it's my honor to MC this weekend's event and greet you all. This being our second symposium on restorative justice, this weekend's theme is forgiveness and reintegration.
My wonderful 17-year-old son, and Jason was, I don't put him on a pedestal, but he was a good kid. And we loved him like we love all of our children. And he was walking down a hallway minding his own business, right where he was supposed to be going to English class, when his life came to an end. And it shouldn't have ended. But it did. But if I use that as my justification to be angry, all that I'm going to do is damage myself and my family and gain nothing. I realize that revenge is a losing proposition. See, what do I want? I want my son back. I want my son to be alive. I don't want to be talking to you tonight. I'd rather have my son at home with me. But the reality is I can't have that. But if I let myself go to that place of anger, because I've got all the justification in the world to do that, then I lose. I lose big time. My family loses big time. And my life gets damaged and diminished greatly by that. So the first point I want to make with you is that forgiveness sets the one who forgives free. It doesn't matter even what the response of the other party is. I'm set free.
Even if they are not repentant, like in the case of my brother, they never arrested anybody, so I cannot say is that person repentant or not. But the fact that he is not repentant just makes the journey of forgiveness a bit harder. Because I have to forgive for my own sake. Because if I do not forgive, I'm going to build a prison around myself that is worse than the prison that the guys are being put in. And it goes on, and you start realizing that forgiveness is a decision of the will, and forgiveness is you need to keep choosing life. You need to keep choosing life, and there are some days where it's harder, but there are some days that it's easier. But also it has nothing to do with forgetting.
One night I found myself asking God for help, and it wasn't to release me from the prison I had found myself in. It was to release me from the one I had actually been living in for the better part of my life. I wanted to sincerely know forgiveness, and I needed someone or something to guide me in the right direction. And since that day, I have been doing that. I have been following the path that is shown to me. I myself am in prison for murder, and believe that all too often we label a crime without looking at the personal emotional aspects of it. What have I learned about forgiveness in 4 years of incarceration? I've learned that forgiveness is not something given in half measures, and that those who seek it don't always know how to give it. You either forgive wholly or not at all. Forgiveness is a gift, and the only one God says to give freely. We offenders and victims, having something in common, must learn that guilt and shame are our enemies. There is no healing with guilt and shame.
Being involved with the restorative justice for myself is a form of giving back to the community. The people that do come in from the community listen, and I listen as well to what they have to say. Sharing our ideas and sharing our thoughts on what is going on currently and what has gone on in my life, and sharing that, and my experiences with the court systems, my experiences with just pretty well everything that I've been involved in since I was young. I think it contributes, and there's a lot of things that could be different, that should be different, and if I can help in that, that's a start.
challenging experience because I do feel humbled. There's nothing I can do to take back the pain I've caused. Nothing. I can only keep on striving and hoping that there will be ways in which I can find reparation in other ways, in other formats that I can help with kids and in crime prevention and making my community safer, and being a better father and a better community member than I would have been had this not happened. And really our sentences don't end when we get out of jail, they begin. Our lives started a very different way than they ever were before. I worked my way through prison and I was released 8 years ago now. And when I got out, I still had that desire to somehow find a way to pay back. And God, through that process, has helped me to find ways, although I still haven't been able to talk to my victims or the people that were directly affected by my murder. But I was able to deal with my secondary victims, my own family. God's given me an awful lot of resolution with that.
Restorative justice is not a single, discrete act. It's a process, and it involves many people over a long period of time getting involved in things which are entirely new to them.
I realized once again that the answer lies in our capacity to love and care for people. And when I make that statement, I'm not just talking about our immediate families or our close friends. I'm talking about the unlovable people. I'm talking about the people that we don't want to be friends with. Do we have the capacity to care about their well-being? Do we have the capacity to not be so self-centered and to share ourselves with them? I believe that's part of the key to turning it all around, to making a difference in our world. A lot of things need to be changed in our society. A lot of attitudes need to change. And you are here as part of that solution. So I leave the challenge with you. I bring it down to you as a person. What's in your heart? Do you have that capacity? And if not, how are you going to find it? And if you do, how are you going to increase it? Because the job is huge, but the rewards are worth it.
Restorative justice builds on an understanding of crime that is more than just law-breaking, but that also involves injury to victims, to communities, to even the offenders and their families.
Restorative justice is about rehabilitation at a certain level. It's about deterrence and about protecting the community from offenders.
Restorative justice is both a philosophical and a spiritual movement, reflecting on criminal justice reform. Whatever else crime might mean in the conventional criminal justice system, it means something very, very specific in restorative justice. It says that crime breaks human relationships, that what it does is destroy the peace and security felt in community, that it makes it impossible for victims and offenders alike to continue living in peace and security unless those harms have been healed. In short, what restorative justice says is that the harms caused by crime have to be healed through peace.
April 28th began as a typical day in the life. We were doing typical things. My wife and I had gone into Lethbridge, Alberta, which is a half-hour drive from where we live in Tabor, to do some shopping. We got in the door and the phone was ringing. The voice on the other end of the line said, "This is the hospital calling. Your son Jason is in the emergency ward, and it's very serious. You need to come to the hospital right now." We got to the hospital and got into the emergency, full of anxiety and fear, of course. A person greeted us and said, "Your son Jason's been shot." Can't tell you how shocking, how unbelievable to hear those.
The history of the theology. And I started discovering that in the best of tradition, there's a lot of violence, but there's always also a trend that starts speaking that in any conflict that arises, we must hear the voice of the victim. But we must also listen to the story of the offender. And so I started doing more research, and I discovered that what I call an incredible treasure, which is restorative justice.
Words. I can't tell you how much we all live in that place where it always happens somewhere else to somebody else.
None of it makes sense. Why would anyone take a 13-year-old girl to a shack, on her way home, obviously on her way home from school, and tie her and leave her there to die? None of it makes sense. And to this day, we don't know who did it.
In March of 1980, I received a phone call early one morning from an RCMP officer from Montreal telling me that my brother had been found murdered and left dead in a field outside of Montreal. So then you become the victim. And then I needed then a frame of reference for me to be able to keep functioning in the ministry. And then I started looking more closely at the Bible, at